Hello everyone, it's Mike G back here with another Golden Age detective review, this time from a brand new author for my channel, G.K. Chesterton. Chesterton was a well-known British author who, in addition to his writings on Christian apologetics, that is, defending Christianity and eventually more specifically Catholicism, wrote quite a few short stories featuring a detective priest named Father Brown. Yes, the protagonist of this short story collection of mysteries, The Innocence of Father Brown, is, just as it sounds, a Roman Catholic priest. More on that and how it complements the detective work in a minute. I'm going to keep this review spoiler-free for the first half, and then in the second half I'm going to mention a little bit about each of the 12 mysteries in this collection, which will include a few spoilers. I'll warn you when I'm getting there. This was the second work I've read by G.K. Chesterton. About 2 or 3 years ago I read his book The Man Who Was Thursday, an allegorical novel that many people seem to love, but for me either went totally over my head or was just totally not my cup of tea. The problem with that book was that although it really pulled me in at first with Chesterton's clever writing, almost even too clever at times, it seemed to go nowhere in terms of plot, or rather by halfway through it seemed like all the aspects of the story that at first seemed interesting and exciting had been undermined by this weird series of developments that sucked all the real suspense out of what had originally promised to be a good story. But that's neither here nor there, because The Innocence of Father Brown, as a collection of short detective stories, takes a different direction, and one that I enjoyed much more. G.K. Chesterton's Father Brown series is one of many classic detective works from the so-called Golden Age of British crime writing, and so I found myself bound to check it out eventually. I believe Father Brown is only featured in short stories rather than any full-length novels, which seems to work just fine here. Father Brown is, as he sounds, a Roman Catholic priest apparently inspired by some of Chesterton's own role models. Chesterton himself converted to Catholicism roughly a decade after the writing of this first collection, but his admiration of the Catholic faith is already evident by the fact that he chose a Catholic priest as his protagonist. And Father Brown's role in mystery investigations is certainly influenced by his career as a priest. First of all, we learn in the first story that he's become deeply familiar with the workings of the criminal underground because so many criminals have revealed to him their secrets in repentance. And beyond that, Father Brown's motivation in solving crimes is centered more around bringing the criminal to repentance and atonement rather than bringing the criminal to justice, meaning that in more than one case, his criminals sort of get off the hook, at least within the legal system. In some ways, this tendency represents an idealistic and tidy view of human nature, where every criminal or sinner, deep in his or her soul, has a true inner sense of morality and can be persuaded to see the inherent wrongness of his or her actions. You may or may not agree with this notion, but it's certainly a characteristic of Chesterton's worldview, as are many of the grander ideas embodied by his protagonist, Father Brown. I get the impression that many modern readers find Father Brown's character a bit off-putting and find Chesterton's writing style overly preachy or moralizing. Which kind of makes sense. I mean, many detectives in mystery stories are a tad smug or arrogant or something like that, but it works better with them than it does with a priest, because it's maybe a lot easier to forgive with an adorable and fatherly but highly conceited figure like Agatha Christie's Hercule Poirot than it is to forgive a priest who comes across a little bit as morally superior to his companions and more than a little bit snarky. Still, Father Brown never went so far as for me to find him really unlikable in his cleverness. His humble stature and his tendency to stand in the background until he's figured everything out gave him the right balance of self-assuredness and meekness to at least make it an interesting story. Some modern criticism of the Father Brown series is also undoubtedly a reaction to the conservativeness of the writing, the fact that it often feels a little bit afraid of the foreign and unknown rather than fully embracing it, even though Chesterton was not quite the most conservative voice of his time. Chesterton brings his readers into a world of mystery, suspense, and adventure, yet his characters and his own worldview have their limits. In particular, some of Chesterton's skepticism of Eastern religions comes across in Father Brown's character and in some of the suspects we encounter. Unfortunately, within the context of these short stories, there's not really enough opportunity to break down what these alternative ideas to Christianity that are espoused by some of the suspects actually represent or tackle them on their own merits. So in these stories, the ideological points usually simply felt like a clash between a Catholic priest, Father Brown, and these sort of straw man victims who easily crumbled under the pressure of the truth. And thus I didn't find these stories particularly compelling in an ideological or moralistic sense, other than to illustrate what Chesterton's own views were. You're also getting a highly male perspective in these stories. The few women that do appear here rarely occupy a foreground role, except when shown as the helpless victim or as a candidate for one of the more central male characters to marry. Or, of course, as a dead body. In fact, I'm having a hard time thinking of any woman character in these 12 stories that was particularly interesting or well developed, even as a potential villain. Does this accurately represent some of the circles of society that G.K. Chesterton is describing? Quite possibly yes, but even the stories with a domestic setting still generally center upon the business of men, and the women occupy the periphery. Certainly if you compare Chesterton's writing with some short stories by Agatha Christie, like those in Poirot Investigates, Christie features more women characters with more interesting development, all while seeming realistic still for the time that the stories were written. This all merits consideration, but I still found these stories enjoyable for what they were. First and foremost, these stories remain detective stories, and that's what pulls the reader through them. I found most of the mysteries quite clever, in fact, probably more so than the ones in Agatha Christie's short story collection, Poirot Investigates, which I also did enjoy, although it's been a while since I read that one. And given the time these stories came out, they likely influenced many of the other British Golden Age detective writers. If I didn't mention it already, I think this first collection came out around 1910, which was before any of Agatha Christie's writings came out, I believe. One thing I found especially enjoyable was the skillful balance between developing the mystery and developing the story, the atmosphere. I never felt like I was reading just a straight-up mystery, as I do for many of Agatha Christie's works, nor did I feel like the mystery investigation was leaning too heavily on the story and the characters for support, at least in most of the stories, as I sometimes find with the Lord Peter Wimsey novels. And that's not a criticism of either of those other writers, since each is their own style. It's more just to say that I think Chesterton accomplished this especially well. The writing style on more of a sentence level also merits discussion here. There are some authors who write beautiful prose, or at least prose that perfectly portrays the spirit or mood they're trying to capture, and then when you really break the writing down, when you pay closer attention, you notice that they've done it through a bunch of clever literary devices, be they metaphors, paradoxes, or more word-focused things like internal rhymes and alliteration. For G.K. Chesterton, the wordplay is clearly often an end in itself. You get the sense when reading these stories, especially the more narratively descriptive ones like The Secret Garden or The Sins of Prince Saradine, that he was having just so much fun crafting the sentences themselves. And in some of these stories, it is, frankly, a little bit much. Like, you'll have a hard time not noticing the alliteration once you start noticing it. Chesterton is so consistent with his consonants that I was constantly contemplating the coming completion of his current comment. Thus, although his descriptive passages are far from boring or clunky, you get the sense that the beauty in these passages is more an emergent property of his clever wordplay rather than the other way around. It's not the most beautiful writing I've read, partly because at times this wordplay actually does grab my attention away from the actual content of the narrative, but I found it enjoyable to read, and it certainly gives the storytelling a certain clever, charming style. As a result, though, Chesterton himself always feels immediately present to the reader, almost as an external character in his own narrative. You never forget that he's there. My final verdict before I get into the spoilers is that this short story collection is well worth reading, though I think you should approach it just open to the fact that the ideologies embodied by Father Brown might not fully agree with your own. Will I be reading more of Father Brown, though? Yes, I definitely will. Alright, now the spoilers are going to be coming up very soon. Okay, spoilers beginning. I'm going to run through the stories now, roughly in order from least favorite to favorite, though I liked most of them in their own ways, so don't consider it too much of a slight if a story doesn't rank very highly but you liked it. First up was The Sins of Prince Saradine, which talks about how Father Brown's companion, Detective Flambeau, decides while on a sailing trip to meet up with someone who apparently was an admirer of his work back when he was a famous criminal. How could this possibly go wrong? The exploration and sailing vacation aspect of this, the overall setting the scene, was pretty immersive to me, but it did sometimes get in that territory of being so descriptive and full of wordplay, particularly the alliteration, that I was paying attention to the words themselves more than the actual content of the writing. And the mystery itself was not quite so interesting, as I really didn't even understand what it was that we were trying to figure out until the very end. Next up was The Flying Stars, which is about a jewel theft committed during a stage performance. The whole performance aspect was not for me, at least partly because I just wasn't familiar with the actual story they were retelling. The solution to the crime was kind of clever, although more than the other stories in this book, It seemed to rely heavily on luck in timing. I'm cool with that since this is supposed to be a master criminal's last crime, but I would have liked to see something a little more foolproof, explaining how he was able to time everything perfectly. There was a little political commentary in this one that felt kind of strong at times, but all in all, I think it worked, even if you don't agree with Chesterton's sort of implication that I'm going to paraphrase roughly as socialists are perhaps a bit confused and misinformed, but there are worse crimes in the world than socialism, like a murder. Then there's The Sign of the Broken Sword. This one's about a quest to figure out why a deceased army commander behaved in the last account of his life before he was hanged in a way that seems contrary to everything that was known about his personality. This one started off with some interesting premises, such as the idea that hiding a leaf in a forest or a pebble on a beach is the best way to go, but it was just not that interesting of a story to me. I also, probably more than in any of the other stories, didn't love the moral conclusions drawn in this one. General St. Clair was probably the most abhorrent villain in this novel, in my opinion, seeing that he basically brought about the death of somewhere from tens to 100 people simply to cover up his crime. And it was vaguely implied that his being okay with this somehow stemmed from the bad influence of the Eastern cultures, which, inspired him to form his own harem of women, and it was a slippery slope from there. Okay, the Blue Cross, the first story in this book, is certainly not a bad introduction to the character of Father Brown, as we follow Detective Valentin through London on his pursuit of two would-be priests. The best part of this story for me is simply that it introduces us to the character of Father Brown. I did smile at the premise that Father Brown is as knowledgeable about crime as the great criminal Flambeau, just from hearing repentant criminals come to a confession. This also sets the stage for Father Brown's approach to apprehending criminals, which adheres to the true sacrament of confession. He won't reveal a crime confessed to him, and what's more important to him than bringing criminals to justice is bringing them to repent. It means that some criminals in this book will escape justice, at least in the worldly sense, if not the eternal sense, but also that sometimes he convinces them to turn themselves in once they've seen the wrongness of their actions. Or in the case of Flambeau, Father Brown converts him to a force of good, one of his greatest accomplices, full of knowledge about the criminal underworld. The mystery itself, though, is just average or slightly below average, actually. It relies quite heavily on coincidence, even though it's still kind of clever, and I certainly give it a pass for the way it all comes together, even if it does all feel a bit convenient. We also have the story The Wrong Shape. It takes a little while to uncover exactly what it is that is the wrong shape, and it's the irregularly trimmed corners characterizing all the papers in the victim's study, including his apparent suicide note. Here we're getting into the realm of the mysteries where there are actually some real clues that the reader will have a chance to decipher and attempt to solve, even if many of the details might not be clear until the end. The Wrong Shape fits a form that will be familiar to readers of other mysteries of its time. A locked door mystery at a house with just a few suspects, all of them fairly likely, not to mention a suspiciously convenient suicide note. I really didn't like the portrayal of the Indian man, on whom the characters seem to cast suspicion merely by virtue of him being Indian and for following mystical religions, a suspicion that Father Brown himself seems to condone, which suggests to me that Chesterton might not have thought highly himself of Easterners or especially of Eastern religion. At least these suspicions are unwarranted, but for a writer who aims to convey a sense of wonder and awe at the world and a cultivation of reason as a means for arriving at the truth, his superstitious portrayal of this character feels out of place and off-putting here. The solution to the mystery, however, worked pretty well, even if it wasn't exactly the most surprising idea I've seen, and there were a few clues that allowed me to guess by about midway through who was the murderer, although his exact motives and the sequence of events he followed were still unclear. Another mystery I found pretty decent was The Queer Feet. The premise of this one, which involves the theft of valuable silverware from a high society dinner, is quite interesting. Both the idea of the irregularity of the sound of someone's footsteps and the reason for it, which involves the criminals behaving in a way so that he will appear to the servants as an aristocrat and to the aristocrats as a servant. I think it would have been difficult, though, especially for modern readers, to quite piece this together. You might have at least had an inkling of what was going on, although I did not. The way it's told is also unconventional, as the criminal is basically apprehended before we even know what crime has been committed, and only then do we learn about what's happened and begin to start piecing together how it might have occurred. The Honor of Israel Gow was another story that I found fairly interesting. In this one, we're investigating the death of a quite reclusive member of the Scottish nobility, and as we visit the family castle along with our protagonists, we're trying in particular to figure out what his servant Israel Gow knows or doesn't know about the death of his late master. There are a handful of relevant clues found at the castle, and when one of the other inspectors remarks that he couldn't imagine what these clues have in common, we're treated to one of my favorite passages in the whole book, in which Father Brown lists off at least 3 plausible and totally different connections between these objects, before laughing it off each time and saying none of these are correct, but he just wanted to show how wrong it is that there is no possible explanation. I quite enjoyed this story, partly because of the mystery and its solution, and partly because I think the story was told in a way that in this case really did convey a sense of adventure and wonder. Of course, for all the appreciation the reader may feel for the Scottish environment and characters while reading, the investigators still feel quite superstitious in this one about the pagan Scottish rituals in a way that Father Brown sort of seems to buy into as well. But in this case, as in many mystery short stories by Chesterton's contemporaries involving the occult or the mysterious, it ultimately is a distraction to the overall solution, but one that works quite well for establishing the mood of the story. The Three Tools of Death was another quite entertaining story, and it's a good thing it was too, because it was the last mystery in the collection, leaving a good taste in my mouth. Not only is this story told in an interesting way, but the mystery is quite interesting, and we have several suspects, several clues, and several twists in how we're led to interpret things. Many of the suspects seemed to me at least superficially keen on protecting others from suspicion, which of course confused the investigation entirely. Plus, we also run into this issue where there seem to be too many possible explanations for how the man could have been killed, hence the title of this story, The Three Tools of Death. Although I liked the ultimate solution to this mystery, the one thing I really just didn't buy into was that the secretary, I think that's who he was, he basically confessed to the crime because he didn't want the man's daughter to think she played a role in enabling her father to commit suicide. This was really far-fetched to me, and I think not done as well as it could have been. Also, although it seemed very plausible that the deceased man's superficially happy demeanor was a cover for his deep depression and suicidal thinking, we're told that the reason for his depression was because he'd become an atheist, which of course, given the level of actual critical reflection such ideas receive in the book, feels a bit more of a cheap shot than anything that will actually convince the reader of the dangers of atheism. The Secret Garden was one of my favorites too. This second story in the collection was just so bizarre, albeit fairly gruesome, that I couldn't help but to be drawn in, and it left me eager to read the remainder of the mysteries in this collection. While it's tough to see exactly what's going on for a while, once we see the connection between the execution by guillotine and the beheading of the victim in the garden, some readers will likely piece together the clues. Father Brown also employs an interesting expository device that Agatha Christie's Poirot often will use as well, which is to ask 5 questions, some of them seemingly even minor or irrelevant, that to most readers will not seem sufficient for solving the mystery, but then once they're answered, it becomes evident just how important they are. As for me, in the back of my mind, I noticed that the only person who would have known about the executions and had access to the guillotine was the Detective Valentin himself, and yet I still absentmindedly discarded this possibility, probably thinking, well, it can't be the head detective because he's the one who's here to support Father Brown and to usher him into the crime-solving business. And thus, in a great bit of surprise, this seeming protagonist-to-be becomes a villain, although not for long. And the villain Flambeau, appearing in the previous story, is before long going to become a detective and a hero. Alright, we've made it to my third favorite in the collection, which was The Eye of Apollo. I like this one a lot, and for me at least, this was one of the most solvable ones in the book. By the time it was reiterated that the murdered woman was alone at the moment of the murder, I knew already that my hunch was correct, that she had fallen into an elevator shaft, and it clicked for me why. Because she'd been staring at the sun for too long. The bit involving her sister's ploy to prevent her from creating a valid will still wasn't clear to me until it was revealed, but I did at least deduce that the illegibility of the will probably had something to do with the writer's blindness. The overall tone or atmosphere of this one also wasn't quite as strong as some of my absolute favorites in the collection, which is part of why, despite really enjoying it, I ranked it below the remaining 2. But the philosophical discussions between the self-proclaimed prophet of Apollo and Father Brown were, at least for me, quite amusing, and they made me think, even if I didn't ultimately buy the exact conclusions Chesterton may have intended. The Hammer of God was also just excellent. In this story, in which a man suffers a hammer blow to the head so strong that it seems to have been struck by God himself, I was able to figure out pretty much right from the start what must have happened, that the hammer had been dropped from the steeple of the church. I suspect if you've read the collection, some of you probably surmised this pretty quickly as well. And yet the easiness of this mystery doesn't make it boring at all. I really enjoy the process of seeing suspicion shift from one suspect to the next, and the ultimate rationale for why each would-be killer couldn't really have been the perpetrator. And then we're treated to this wonderful climax where Father Brown accompanies the killer himself to the top of the chapel, and he reveals the solution as they stand looking down on the tiny world beneath them, almost as God might view it. And I have to admit that despite knowing early on how the murder was done, I didn't guess who the killer was until this very last scene, although it's suggested to us right there in the title, as the Reverend might be the most apt to believe he's capable of carrying God's justice. Finally, we have The Invisible Man, which was probably my favorite in the book. I thought this one was simultaneously funny and amusing, and also, kind of suspenseful and frightening. A woman has two unsuitable suitors for marriage, one of whom has been threatening his rival with mysterious letters and is starting to really creep this other guy out. Frankly, he was creeping me out too. The victim of the two believes he's been hearing threatening voices, although he can't seem to figure out where this invisible man behind the voices is hiding. It's a bit hard to tell exactly why this one was my favorite. I mean, it's not one particular thing that stood out, and I didn't figure out the solution to this one, at least until immediately before it was revealed, at which time many readers will probably have figured it out. And the solution itself was not really even the most plausible one in the series, but the pacing of this one, the exact way in which it was told, the final reveal, and even the nature of the characters involved, all of it worked out just excellently for me. And that's all for The Innocence of Father Brown. I hope you enjoyed my run through all the different mysteries, and maybe feel encouraged to pick up some of these short stories yourself. If you did enjoy this, don't forget to like and subscribe. I'm actually working my way right now through the second collection, The Wisdom of Father Brown. It will probably be a slightly shorter review because I have less to say about who Father Brown is, and will probably dive pretty quickly into talking about some of the mysteries and what I enjoyed about them. So you can look forward to that sometime soon. Until next time, though, bye, and happy reading.